What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 45, and I am the host, Kyle Amslone. Got a lot of news to cover on today's show, but want to make one quick announcement first, and that is if anybody is potentially listening on the Foreign Policy Focus feeds, I still get some download numbers coming in from there. Make sure you switch over to the Conflicts of Interest one. If it's not up where you like to listen to podcasts, let me know. There's a couple sites that I have to take down the Foreign Policy Focus ones before I put up the Conflicts of Interest ones. And so listen, subscribe on YouTube. That way you get the video version of the show. And I will try to have the Conflicts of Interest feeds up everywhere as soon as possible. And with that, let's get into the news. The first story I have here is from Reason, titled "Phoenix will pay $3 million settlement after police shoot a man during a noise complaint. The officers are still employed, and of course the taxpayers will foot the bill." All right, so let's get into the details here. The man that was killed was Ryan Whitaker. He was killed on May 21st. I'm sure a lot of you will remember the video where you have two cops on each side of this door. It's clearly the middle of the night. They knock on the door. The guy comes. I'm sure he lets out the peephole. He can't see the cops because they're standing on the sides of the door specifically, so you can't see who they are. He comes to the door with the gun, but keeps the gun at his waist. He opens the door. He sees the cops. He goes to put the gun down, and the cops shoot him anyway. It was Officer Jeff Cook who was the trigger puller there, and yes, he is still on the job. So the first paragraph of this article is that the Phoenix City Council on Wednesday unanimously agreed to pay $3 million to the family of Ryan Whitaker, who was shot and killed several months ago by police investigating a noise complaint, and who did not receive immediate medical assistance after the incident. So there's like kind of four things I want to break down about this story that seem to have roots in like other police shootings as well, and I see as trends. The first is that, you have the upstairs neighbor in this case who essentially was upset that his neighbor was being too loud. And within that call, he even indicates that he, suggests only that the altercation that he believes is going on downstairs could be physical, is to get the police there sooner. And so this is obviously a man who's really frustrated with his neighbor and who says that there's a potential physical abuse situation going on downstairs to get the police to go there quickly. When the police show up, again, the knock and the shooting and everything, but what the girlfriend tells them is that he wasn't beating her or anything, but rather they were playing Crash Bandicoot together. And so, this is one of those cases where if you're the neighbor, you really do have some blame here to call the police with an inflated threat, especially with the way American police act now. And then, but of course, he's not going to have to foot any of this $3 million settlement. And neither the police will either. It's all going to come out of the taxpayers' pockets. And so that's something else that's pretty common, especially in these cities that have fairly progressive city councils and stuff like that. They're willing to dole out huge payments to the victim of police abuse, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But the problem is that they don't ever take the money from the police department or demand that like we need the police officers who shot him will be fired. We're not, any pension that guy had is going to be rolled into this settlement. I mean, they maybe like have him do trash collection and take half his paycheck like they would if they actually imprisoned him. Of course, the officers are still on the job and neither of them are facing charges. You would have to imagine if these were like two, especially like young black men who had shot somebody, and then one guy wasn't the trigger puller but was generally involved in the crime, the criminal act. Well, he would get the felony murder charge and hell, maybe facing the death penalty too. But rather, these being two armed policemen, they just get to continue going about their business. Not the trigger puller, but the other guy actually is still like out on patrol apparently, which is absolutely insane, because it's, he's shown that he's not an officer of the peace. He's not, somebody who's going to go around and help civilians. He's just going to cover up for the murder of his partner. And then, yeah, I mean, I think those were like kind of the bigger topics I wanted to hit on there, where you have, the taxpayers paying, the guy gets shot and doesn't get immediate medical aid. This is something you see really common in police shootings. They'll kill somebody. And then even after the guy is clearly dead, they like sit there with their guns trained on them and stuff like that. It's completely unnecessary. And not only does it look really bad and really upsets the communities and like the families of the people who this happened to, because it's wrong and disgusting. Um, and even if it like doesn't make that much of a difference on the guy, probably would have bled out either way, right? In a lot of these cases, it's not like this is what caused the death, it was the shooting anyways. But it shows the mentality of the police officers, that they really see the people they're policing as the other and not one of them. Because certainly if the police officer had been shot, he would have like doved on his partner and would have been like, hang in there, buddy, you'll make it. Yeah. So let's move on to the next story that I have. And this is from Defense News, and it is about U.S. weapons sales in the fiscal year 2020, and then the government report on that. So the headline here says America sold 175 billion in weapons in fiscal year 2020. So this is from the Defense and State Department reports, and basically what they do is they combine the weapon sales from the export license via the direct commercial sales program, and that was 125 billion, and then another 50 billion of the foreign military sales program. So I mean, like, the government number in the headline kind of suggests that the U.S. sold $175 billion to our allies or partners overseas for the year 2020, but they already identified 2.7 billion that was Defense Department grants here, and so those aren't weapon sales at all. Those are weapons giveaways totaling 2.7 billion that get wrapped up into this number. They say that growth is at 2.8% over the previous year. And so weapon sales during the Trump administration have been high and have been growing. However, I don't know if 175 billion last year is an accurate number. And in this article, it has a quote from William Hartong, and he says, "It's important to note that this is a vastly inflated figure if one is looking for statistics on sales that are actually likely to eventuate in contracts and deliveries." And so I'll get into this a little bit more with the next story, but you oftentimes have countries that will sign intentions with the United States to buy hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons. Like at one point, Saudi Arabia, I think during the Trump administration, agreed to buy $350 billion worth of weapons from the US. However, there were some of those weapons that they had already agreed to buy, and some of those sales will never actually happen. And so the $350 billion number is a little bit misleading. I think the headline number is a little bit misleading here. However, I think like the 2.8% growth is probably an accurate, reflection of how the U.S. has continued to increase weapon sales under the Trump administration. So the next story I have here is from Reuters, and it is titled U.S. Senate bats massive arms sales to UAE after Trump veto threat. And so what you had is after the signing of the Abraham Accords, which are the normalization agreements between Israel and now four other majority Arab countries, with Morocco joining, Bahrain, the UAE, and Sudan. The Trump administration has portrayed that this is a peace deal, but that's fairly inaccurate. Really, what they've gotten these majority Muslim countries to do is do away with the policy of the Arab League that said that they wouldn't normalize relations with Israel until Israel had a normal situation with the Palestinians. So that was like a 2002 thing that has now fallen apart, as most countries have essentially given up on anyways, but now these four countries have overtly agreed to normalize relations with Israel. And so that those are the Abraham Accords. A lot of these countries have pretty deep covert relationships with Israel, anyways, including like military and intelligence ones. And so, in no way is this like a peace deal, but it is, a change in the overt policy of like the UAE and Israel. Now, one of the things that Trump agreed to do to get the UAE to buy into this Abraham Accord is agree to sell them $23 billion worth of weapons, and those sales were going to include F-35s and armed drones. Now, this is something that a few senators took exception with, including Bob Menendez, Chris Murphy, and Rand Paul. There's a few reasons. One is the war in Yemen, where the U.S. has just been supporting Saudi Arabia and the UAE's ruthless near genocide against the people of Yemen, where the UN is now saying there's hundreds of thousands of people on the brink of famine, and at least 250,000 people already dead from that conflict. And it's just a war of aggression inflicted on the people of Yemen, and then a siege of their company by Saudi Arabia's navy. And it's all backed by the United States. We're all letting this happen. And so that's one reason you don't want to sell these weapons to the UAE, because the UAE will start hovering Predator drones over Yemen and dropping missiles on whoever they don't like, just like the U.S. Has done in the past with like Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so expanding this ability and letting the UAE do this is very disturbing. Now, I believe the UAE already has like Chinese-made drones, although they're nowhere near as like effective and advanced as the U.S. ones. The other reason that some Democrats, I'm guessing this is one of Bob Menendez's concerns, is there's something called the Qualitative Military Edge, QME, that Israel is supposed to maintain over all of its neighboring states. And so if we're selling the UAE the F-35, and we already sold Israel the F-35, that puts both countries on the same plane with their fighter jets, and that's not allowed to happen. And so that was another reason that some people were objecting to these weapon sales. Now, the Senate votes to approve somewhat slim margins, I think 50-46 and 49-47, that these were voted to approve. Now, most weapon sales don't even get votes at all. Most of them just, get approved and go through the motions. However, if the Congress or Senate wants to, they can step up and propose resolutions to block weapon sales, and that's what happened here. Unfortunately, both of those efforts have now failed. It doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that the UAE will get these weapons. It's very possible that as time goes on with the Biden administration and changes and stuff like that, they may not sell these weapons. I doubt it. It looks like Biden's Secretary of Defense is a Raytheon employee, and so I'm guessing that he's going to be pretty committed to keeping up weapon sales. However, there's optics, all that's important, and so it's not impossible that there would be some kind of change to the weapon sales. As I talked about in the previous story, it could even be selling them less of the products. It's not whether they get $23 billion worth of U.S. weapons or zero. It could be 23 billion versus 15 billion or something like that. But it's not guaranteed that they're going to get the F-35, but this is a major hurdle that they just cleared. It's also worth knowing that Trump threatened to veto that resolution, and so they weren't anywhere near the veto proof they would need it. Before I get into the next story, I did want to take a quick second to thank the sponsor of the show, and that is Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde sells amazing CBD products that are lab tested, so no more gas station gummy worms that you don't know exactly what's in it, but rather soft gels, extracts, and creams with their exact dosing on them. You could actually go on the website and see the lab tested results. PalomaVerdeStore.com is the website. They have an education sheet as well. So if you're not somebody who already uses CBD and you're wondering how CBD could help you, check that out. And then, of course, if you're already a CBD user, the reason you should get your products at Paloma Verde is that they're quality products. And the guy who runs Paloma Verde is a great libertarian. He and his wife, Carlos and Vanessa, were actually trying to have like a storefront location, but unfortunately, that was killed by the COVID lockdowns. And so he's, just morphed his business and adopted this web-based platform and has partnered with this show to try to get some product sales. And so help the show, help Carlos, help the great libertarians, and check out Paloma Verde and get your CBD products there. Be sure to use the promo code PEACE. The promo code PEACE, easy to remember, with conflicts of interest, and you'll get a discount checkout, and you'll let him know that we sent you. The next story I have here is from Yahoo Finance, and it's about the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. Pretty recently, I talked to Dave DeCamp, who is my colleague at antiwar.com. He's the assistant news editor there. And me and him broke down a lot of the different measures and provisions within the NDAA. However, this is something that we didn't talk about. And as the title of the article suggests, Russia to Germany gas pipeline targeted in defense bill. The NDAA is requiring sanctions against any company that helps to construct the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline runs from Russia to Central Europe and is going to bring liquid natural gas into Central Europe and make the energy there cheaper. And the U.S. doesn't want this because we have a liquefied natural gas industry and these huge ships that we put that on and we ship it over to Central Europe and Germany and stuff like that. And so this will, of course, be cheaper and, the preferred product. However, the U.S. doesn't want it because, again, it's going to hurt our industry. It's an $11 billion project and it's 90% complete, but the U.S. says if you work on it now, you're going to get sanctioned for it. It'll be interesting to see what the Biden administration does with this. I'm guessing it'll be fairly unpopular in Central Europe, especially with Germany, for threatening to sanction their companies. Although this has been like a delicate political issue for them all along, and at times Germany is sometimes pretty aggressive with their Russian rhetoric, anyways. But the U.S. especially in the hots here will often prey upon this narrative and say that, oh, this is going to open Europe up to Russian exploitation because they will become dependent on Russian energy. And then the evil Russians will cut off that energy to force, I don't know, Germany to rejoin the Warsaw Pact or something crazy like that. Their ore is never really stated. It's just like big boogeyman Russia gonna do something, right? Anyways, it's ridiculous because if that did happen, they could just go back to buying the American gas at a higher price. But anyways, that's the argument there. I think it's pretty weak. This is one of the worst things in the 2021 NDAA that has now passed the House. I'm sure I'll have more on that in weeks to come. I saw on Twitter just before I went on, actually, Rand Paul was slamming Liz Cheney over it. So hopefully I'll have more of those details and talk to you about that next week. The next thing I had to talk about today is the MORE Act. That is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act of 2019. And this actually got a vote of approval in the House and was the first time the House has voted to essentially decriminalize marijuana. So there's a few things in this bill I want to go over. I don't actually think it's going to become the law of the land, but there's some good and there's some bad in it. Part of the good is it does focus on expungement some, and there is some different things within the bill to help people who have federal marijuana crimes get out of jail or get those expunged. These really do hurt people. If you're a young man who's gotten a marijuana offense, it's very unlikely you'll be able to get student aid if that's especially a federal marijuana expense. So getting those undone, and then of course, not having to put your fentanyl on these job applications is huge too. So that's I think the best part of the bill. The okay part of the bill is the actual, I think, mechanisms where they, legalize or decriminalize marijuana. It puts a lot of power into the hands of the attorney general, and I think it calls for him to reschedule marijuana. For people who don't know why rescheduling or what scheduling is, you drugs in the U.S. are on schedule like I think through five, 1 through 5, where something that's like super okay to take, like like aspirin or something like that, where it could have some risk. I'm sure you could overdose on it, but it's generally safe and most people could use it safely, is like a schedule like 3 or 4, I think. um where heroin is a schedule 1 because it's highly addictive, it's easy to overdose on, stuff like that, right? So opiates, all that's one. Also in the one category is marijuana, because getting high on weed is the same thing as getting high on meth, according to the government, and those should be treated the same way criminally and by use of police. And so what they're doing is they're calling, I guess, to deschedule marijuana. So I don't know exactly what that means, if they're gonna make it like a schedule 2, a schedule 3, or if they're just going to like completely take it off of the scheduling issue. Then it's not really specific, I guess, on like how the DEA will change. And I guess this will come through the attorney general as well. But you do have states like California where, and this is actually who Joe Biden's attorney general is going to be, where despite having a legal marijuana and a really, I think, a pretty liberal in the sense of free and anyone could like kind of do it, like liberal view of marijuana in California, they continue to crack down on like illegal operations, and people who look to use their marijuana with that outside of the state regulations and apparatus. So it's not impossible. We still want to see a fair amount of marijuana enforcement in the U.S. anyways. And then the worst part, the ugliest part of this, is it does include a 5% tax on marijuana products, which is terrible. Now, some people see 5% and they say, well, shrug, 5% isn't that much. And, in exchange for the benefits that will come from legalizing marijuana, I do think 5% tax is a little bit something to shrug at, but something tells me it won't stay a 5% tax forever. Overall, I think it's a positive step for the House to vote on this, and I think we see that some in this article I have here from the Daily Caller, titled "Rep Gaetz," that's Matt Gaetz of Florida, asks fellow Republicans to flip on marijuana legalization. And basically, what Matt Gaetz is saying in this article is, look, the arguments against marijuana legalization are increasingly unpopular. And as Republicans, if we want to be popular, we want to, win seats and stuff like that, then we had to vote to pass marijuana legalization. And he voted for it. And I think this is, there's a lot of things not to like about Matt Gaetz. And so I don't want this to sound like a full throat endorsement of this guy or something like that. But the Republican Party moving in the direction of Matt Gaetz isn't a bad thing, especially when he's willing to legalize marijuana and he wants to end the wars. Like, he understands some of the worst things going on that the U.S. government is doing and seems legitimately interested in undoing them. And so this isn't the worst direction for the Republicans to be going. And I guess we'll continue to see what happens with the marijuana legalization going forward. My guess is that the Senate is really going to drag on this. And again, even if it does get legalized, I think there's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles it has to overcome. In Massachusetts, what they did, they legalized marijuana and then they wouldn't legalize anyone to sell it. So it was still illegal, right? If you can't get marijuana legally, then it's not legal, even if, they say it's not illegal to possess marijuana. They just budgeted on the transaction then. All right, the next thing I have is probably the most important thing I have to talk about in today's show, and that is the likely incoming Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And I have this article here by Danny Shershin, published originally at SheerPost, but reprinted at antiwar.com, titled "Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, a Certain Kind of Diversity." Lloyd Austin is I believe, 4-star general. And, for those of you who don't know who he is, he's actually a little bit of a quiet character for the U.S. empire, even being on the low radar end side for a general. He is one of the first black 4-star generals, and yeah, so he's a 4-star, and he's a black man. And so if you're looking at the coverage of him, people continue to applaud Joe Biden's diversity. Now, as Danny indicates in his title, that this is a certain kind of diversity. It's not the kind of diversity of thought that you would expect, or that they indicate comes with diversity of race, but rather it is just merely a black man who has the same ideas as, all of his predecessors. Danny in his article says that he didn't personally meet him, but he seems to be a decent soldier. And that's about the only positive thing that Danny says about him. So when you're talking about the nomination, I think the two big things that will come up are that this will be the first black Secretary of Defense, and I don't want to focus on that much. I just think that's going to be one of the big arguments that they brought up whenever you were arguing, let's say, the nomination of Gina Haspel as CIA director. A lot of the arguments for her was she was going to be the first woman to run it, and so I think that'll be a lot of the arguments for this guy. However, there is another issue that's a little bit more substantive, I think, and that is the civilian control over the military. And so it's written into U.S. law that the Secretary of Defense cannot be somebody who's either in the military or who has retired in the past 7 years. And I think only one person has ever gotten that waiver, and it was General Mattis, who was appointed 4 years ago under Donald Trump. And to be honest, I think the reason that they gave Mattis the waiver is, if you'll remember back to the idea at the time, especially among the establishment, is that it was going to be the adults in the room like James Mattis that reined Donald Trump in. And so I think there were a lot of people who were okay with putting Mattis in that position, who otherwise may have really raised an issue over this, the decorum of it not being a recent general. Now, on the actual implementation level, I guess there's probably worse things than having a former general as the Secretary of Defense. This guy might not be as bad as Michelle Flournoy, who was never a soldier. And so it isn't necessarily a bad thing, although I do think the majority of these 4-stars and stuff who would get put in this position likely have pretty bad foreign policy. There's let's say another issue, I guess, is there seems to be an increasing position in the US where the military is objective, I suppose, that they wouldn't lie us into a war, that they wouldn't lie to increase their budget and stuff like that. And in fact, I think if you look at the branches of government and the American people's trust in them versus the military, I think the military outranks even the Supreme Court. So this is that's one part of it, is that if you do have this guy up there who, I mean, he on a personal level, he seems like an all right guy, not somebody who would have a pleasant conversation with you, who would be nice to your kids. He doesn't seem like he'd kick your dog or anything like that. Some of these people in government seem like real sociopaths and stuff like that. So he'll have that kind of demeanor. He'll be in the military, and so I think that's going to give him a lot of credibility. The only thing that I guess I could see creating an issue for this guy is if Republicans, really try to line up against him and prevent him from getting this waiver that he'll need, because he won't need just the confirmation vote. He'll also need the waiver. And you've had Democrat senators like Jack Reed, who said when he, voting for the waiver for General Mattis, that this would be the only time he ever voted to give the waiver. And so there are people who really do believe in this decorum in DC. And so that may end up being something that prevents, I think that would be the issue that would prevent Lloyd Austin from getting this position. All right, so the stuff that like my audience definitely and I care about the most is who the hell is this guy and what the hell has he done? And if you want to read Danny's article, I mean that's where you're probably going to get into the most of it. For those of you who watch the video, I do like have it set up to like scroll through the article as we go, so you're more welcome to check that out. But I also looked at a couple other articles, one by Sarah Lazare that was pretty good. And then there was another one by Caitlin Johnstone on her website that was pretty good too. So those are a couple other places that people want to try to get some information on this guy. In 2010, he was the commander of U.S. forces in Iraq. And so, hell, if you remember back to 2010, the U.S. was getting out of Iraq at that time. And maybe this guy's all right, except he actually disagreed with Obama and wanted to leave 24,000 troops in Iraq. Now, Biden also wanted this. Unfortunately for the Hots, the Iraqis told them that there are no way your troops are saying we're not going to extend the status of forces agreement. And so it did force the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq in 2011. In 2016, General Austin became head of CENTCOM. And so that means in 2014, he pushed for the U.S. troops to re-enter Iraq. And we're now at about 3,000 troops there. We've like peaked at 5,000 or 5,500 possibly. And of course, that's also allowed for U.S. troops to enter Syria, and 900 to 1,000 and who knows how many more, 1,500, 2,000 we had there at some point. And so those are, the troops that we have in Iraq and Syria right now are in part there because of General Austin. Now, he may not have been the biggest mover in this policy because he doesn't seem like the type of guy who's like out there trying to set policy, but rather be a rules follower. However, he should have known that these policies were going to be absolutely disastrous and, came out and told the American people that if the president pushes for this, then I'm not going to, be the guy that goes along with committing war crimes. I'm going to resign my position and get out. And I recommend the American people, force the president to adopt that position. So, yeah, there's that. Then of course he was CENTCOM commander from 2003 to 2016, which a lot of that is overseeing the Syrian war, not only the fight against ISIS, but like the arming of the jihadist groups in Syria. I mean, that was a CIA program. The DoD program was to arm the Syrian Kurds, and those groups are squaring off. But again, this was the guy to be out there saying, look, the military is trying to do something responsible in Syria by backing Kurdish groups who aren't suicide bombing, head chopping lunatics, to fight against the Sunni jihadists who were the suicide bombing, head chopping lunatics. But the problem is that the CIA over there, John Brennan, the little gremlin troll ogre in the basement of the White House, is over there backing all these crazy jihadist groups. And so this is creating a real problem in Syria, but he never goes along with that. Also, he was the head of CENTCOM when the U.S. carried out the airstrike against the Syrian government positions around Deir al-Zor. I think this is in 2015. And the reason this is so critical is that airstrike that killed, I think, about 80 Syrian troops ends up scuttling a deal that John Kerry had worked out with the Russian foreign ambassador, Sergei Lavrov. At this time, John Kerry was Secretary of State. That would have really turned the U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. policy for Syria from one of regime change to one of solely targeting Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the al-Nusra and the jihadist groups there, more in coordination with Russia rather than as opposed to Russia, which has kind of been the policy in Syria ever since. So again, I'm not saying like General Austin ordered that airstrike. I have no idea what his role was, but again, he didn't come out and try to save the deal or anything like that. It was his DoD that carried out the airstrike. And then of course, this also means that he has a lot to answer for about Yemen here. A couple big notes is that as head of the DoD, when the Houthis took over Yemen, the Pentagon was, or not head of the DoD, but head of the DoD policy, CENTCOM. That is Central Command. That's the general that oversees U.S. forces, Iraq, Syria, all the Middle East, Afghanistan. It used to include parts of Africa, but now I think that's all AFRICOM, even Somalia. So Yemen is another place where, this guy is essentially, the president or the vice president in charge of, the company of CENTCOM or whatever that's running U.S. foreign policy for the Middle East. And so in Yemen, you had the Arab Spring in 2011. You had Mansour al-Hadi take over in 2012 after the longtime dictator was deposed. And then you had the rebel group Houthi take out Hadi after he really tried to screw the Houthi with the new deal he was trying to broker in Yemen. And so when the Houthis took over Yemen, the DoD said, hey, we could work with these guys. They don't like Al-Qaeda, and started working with the Houthis to, target Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the Islamic State in Yemen. However, about a year later in 2012, the Saudis decide that having the Yemen, the Houthis in charge of Yemen rather than their sock puppet Hadi was intolerable to them, and so they decide to start a regime change war that the Pentagon immediately supported. There's a couple things. He actually testified in 2016, I believe, and said that he couldn't comment on the potential success of the war in Yemen because he didn't know what the Saudis' objectives were. And so this is a case where the DoD bats the Saudi war in Yemen against the Houthis. They are critical in allowing Saudis to wage that war. And he's doing that, and he doesn't even know what the Saudi objectives are. So, I mean, this alone absolutely disqualifies him to be the Secretary of Defense. I mean, he's a war criminal who supported the Saudi war against the Houthis, knowing that they had no objectives or had no idea what they were doing there. He also, within that committee hearing, really promoted the idea that Iran wanted to be a regional hegemon, and said Iran enabled the Houthis to do what they have done in Yemen. And there's a few problems with that. The first is that his boss, Barack Obama, acknowledged that the Houthis, when they took over Yemen, were told by the Iranians not to do that would provoke too much of a retaliation. And the Houthis did it anyways. So it's not like they're enabled or acting under the orders of the Iranians. In fact, they're doing contrary to the Iranian objectives. And then the Houthis again were told by Iran, well, after they took the capital city of Yemen, not to try and expand from there. And they've continued to do that since. And so obviously they're not acting under the orders of the Iranians. But this guy is promoting that narrative. A couple more notes about General Austin here is that he is a board member of Raytheon, and I don't think has resigned that position yet. So I don't know how this isn't an issue and isn't this is my far bigger issue than like him being a former general, is him saying on the board of a company that profits from war. What do you think he's going to do? He just spent 4 years on a company of a board that profits from war. He's going to war profiteer. So, I mean, there's that. He's also a partner at Pine Island Capitalist Partners, which, what the hell is that? Apparently, it's the kind of company that gets together and owns smaller military industrial complex firms. And so this guy's going to have a whole bunch of financial interest in making sure the wars continue. I mean, he sounds like a horrible choice, but we'll see how things unfold. Again, just because he's horrible doesn't mean that he's the worst option that Joe Biden looked at in Michelle Flournoy. Moving on here, I have an article from Consortium News about Julian Assange. And it is titled Assange Extradition, Top UN Anti-Torture Official Again Urges Assange's Relief. And this guy is Niels Melzer, and his official position is UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. And he had a statement saying that there's a huge number of people in Belmarsh prison. I guess 65 of the 165 inmates have tested positive for COVID, and Julian Assange is has some heart problems and has respiratory infections. And so, when you look at like even people who are skeptical of the coronavirus, like the people who signed the Great Barrington Declaration, what they call for is to protect increasing vulnerable populations. And Assange was certainly falling that risk, especially since the guy really hasn't been outside in 8 years. And so, this is a real reason to worry about Assange's health. And again, you have this high-ranking UN official, and if the UN said China has bad human rights, the US would levy sanctions against China for that. But when the UN says, oh, the UK, US, and Sweden have worked to put Julian Assange over psychological torture because he had exposed their crimes, then that guy gets completely ignored, and they're not going to do that. I'm not going to, go into the, long, story of why Julian Assange shouldn't be imprisoned anyways, but it seems like there's an increasing concern over his health. And again, I understand that not all 49-year-olds will be at increased risk for COVID, but it does seem like Assange is in that category and somebody who, needs to be free. So we, continue to publish and get the documents out that show the crimes of the world empire here. All right, the next story I have is an interesting one, but I really want to talk about because I think it really marks how hysterical we have become about coronavirus. Mass mink grave in Denmark may have soiled groundwater, according to a report, and this is from Reuters, published today, December 10th. And it says, deposing minks buried in dirt pits in Denmark followed a nationwide cold may have contaminated groundwater, local Radio 4 reported Thursday, citing a government agency report. And so what happened is the Danish government ordered all 17 million minks in the country to be murdered. They called it coal, I guess, because it's like a nicer sounding thing. Maybe people would have a problem if you said we're going to exterminate all the minks. And so I think they gassed them. And this was over a, I think, pretty hysterical concern that like it was going to like create a mutated coronavirus that was going to infect and kill everyone, right? And so then they buried all these minks. Well, the first problem is when the minks started to decompose, I guess the gas from the decomposing bodies and stuff started to cause the minks to essentially rise from the ground, and so you have a whole bunch of the dead minks already surfacing. And now, as they're decomposing, they're affecting the groundwater. And so I think this is another case where we have something in coronavirus that, if you're a part of the vulnerable population, is probably pretty serious to you, but for most of us isn't life-threatening or anything like that. And we're acting as if it's Ebola and then creating more problems. And so we're seeing rashes of suicides, all kinds of people losing their business, people increasingly homeless and food insecure, even in wealthy countries. The UN's reporting 10,000 children a month are dying from the lockdowns, just the economic impacts of those in Africa. And so, we have all those. And then this is just one story where you just see it so clearly that by overreacting to the threat of COVID, and look, some people say you can overreact to the threat of COVID. Yes, you can. Now they've poisoned their groundwater. And so this is just again, another example of the overreaction to COVID. And I thought it was an interesting story, and reminded me of when people were able to identify an overreaction to something like this, like in 2012 or 13, there was a H1N1, the swine flu outbreak, and Egypt started to kill all the pigs, and everybody was like, you're an idiot, why would you do that? And this seems like kind of the same situation. The next article I have here is by Daniel L. Davis and published at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and it is titled "Civilian Deaths Spike After U.S. Taliban Use Violence as Leverage for Talks." And so this is a theme I've talked about on the show a lot, where I don't want to say don't engage in peace talks. However, one of the negative consequences of like peace talks or ceasefire talks are once the ceasefire or peace is established, you really can't gain any more ground if it holds. And so you try to get everything you can before. And so that's probably the Taliban game. The US game has been to essentially bomb the Taliban into quitting, which isn't going to happen. Daniel Davis says that US let's see. A new study released Monday revealed something shocking. Thanks to loosened rules of engagement, the number of Afghan civilians killed as a result of U.S. and allied bombing skyrocketed 300% in the last 3 years. This is a significant increase in Afghan death, combined with the huge toll of overall American casualties, should finally convince the American policymakers that the war is unwinnable and should be ended without delay. The new report from Brown University Cost of War Project focuses on Afghan civilian population and deaths due to Taliban, the U.S.-led coalition, and the Afghan National Security Forces over the last 4 years. The report says the U.S. has eased the rules of engagement beginning in 2017 to gain leverage in negotiation and the war with the Taliban. In 2019, the study concluded U.S. and allied airstrikes killed 700 civilians, more than any year since the beginning of the war in 2001. And so even as you had the U.S. seriously engaged in peace talks with the Taliban, they were killing a huge number of civilians in the country. Daniel Davis points out that the three takeaways we should have from the report. In terms of strategic effectiveness, it should be now plainly obvious that increasing airstrikes on the Taliban was never going to make them buckle and sue for peace. Second, it should have been patently obvious that loosening rules of engagement to such a degree that resulted in thousands of civilian casualties was never going to cow the Taliban nor win us friends with the Afghan population. One of the tenets of counterinsurgency warfare is to win the hearts and minds of the population for the host government. But when the government and allied forces kill almost as many civilians as the enemy, the people become susceptible to Taliban propaganda that the government can't protect them. In such circumstances, the people won't turn on the insurgents and the war drains on inconclusively, which is what the situation in Afghanistan is, 19 years after the war started. His last point is, third, it is troubling that so few in Washington pay attention to a report documenting that our military actions last year alone had killed 700 innocent people. It's not even going to be a topic. And in fact, if you bring it up, you're probably going to be some kind of Trump apologist or a fool, even though you're talking about people that Trump has killed. And because you're not talking about COVID enough or whatever other issue that they really want you to focus on during that day. Again, Daniel Davis, he's the guy who was touring around Afghanistan in 2012 and saw that Obama's surge there was a complete failure and the war needed to end and was ignored. I have one more story on Afghanistan here, and that is Islamic State claims killing a female TV presenter in Afghanistan. And this is a recent story about a TV reporter who was in the Nangarhar province outside Jalalabad in Afghanistan. And the Islamic State claims that they assassinate her. And so very disturbing to see this happen. And it just shows what failure that the U.S. war has been. That 19 years into this war, we've been trying to fight the Taliban to increase female rights and equality in Afghanistan, all that. And here we've actually created a new group in Afghanistan, the Islamic State, and now it's targeting female journalists. And what a failure the U.S. policy there has been. The next story I have is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. By the way, antiwar.com is celebrating his 25th birthday this week. So that's really awesome news. And man, it's just so cool to be a part of that project. And I really enjoy it. They're actually doing their fund drive there. So I know I ask people to get to the show and stuff and everything. So I don't want to be like, hey, get more money. But if you do have the money, and it's a great cause, so give it a thought. This article from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com titled Syrian Observatory Sees Major Decline in Syria War Death Rate. It says that the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which I don't think is, the best source and the definitive source for Syria, says that there's a total of 387,000 people have been killed since the start of the war 10 years ago. But that is only up 7,000 this year. So that's, just looking at the numbers there, pretty obviously decline in the number of people of fighting in Syria. So that's a little bit of a good sign. Among the 387,000 dead are 117,000 civilians and 22,000 children. So those are some really disturbing numbers. And again, it wasn't all the U.S. I mean, there's the Arab Spring in Syria. There were protests against the authoritarian and dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad there. Unfortunately, some people died, in that, and the Syrian government does, not have clean hands in it. However, the U.S. did, really support the rise of the Islamic State, and then, dropped a whole bunch of bombs in Syria and has made it harder for the Assad government to actually fight against the Islamic State and the jihadist groups. Another important note that nobody really ever thinks about is that 130,000 of the people who have died were pro-government fighters. And so, people say Assad has killed 400,000 or 500,000 of his own people. When you look at the numbers, if 130,000 were his men, then, a lot of the people killed were killed by people in opposition to him. The last story I have here is from, again, Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Just go through this one real quick. It's probably going to be something that comes up later in the show, but it's a really important thing to note, and that is Sistani's militia split from Iraq government control. And so you have the Popular Mobilization Forces, which were the Shia militias that banded together to fight against the Islamic State in 2014, 2015, 2016, etc. Now that group has been defeated in Iraq, there are a whole bunch of Shia militants that have guns and armor and stuff, and so they have been kind of a problem for the Iraqi government. And now you have a particular faction, that being those loyal to the Grand Ayatollah, who I think is the highest ranking Shia in the world, actually, are now, under the control of Sistani rather than the government there. I've also read in recent days, I think this was by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, that Muqtada al-Sadr, who's an influential Iraqi Shia cleric, he has a lot of support among the lower income Shia in Iraq. And and he's looking for some more political autonomy and separation and control too. So be interesting to see how things play out in Iraq in the future. It'd be great to not see American troops in the midst, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen, as Trump seems to be committed to ending his administration with at least 2,500 there. All right, that's where I'll wrap for today. Just appreciate it if people could subscribe to the show somewhere on one of the conflicts of interest feeds, particularly the YouTube channel. You go patreon.com/conflicts of interest to support the show. But if you can't get financially, think about giving the show a share. I put it up everywhere. And click the share button, the like button, all that stuff. And I appreciate people tuning in. Be back with new shows next week.